So in a story that took a surprising turn today, Aspen Ladd ended up going before the California State Athletic Commission looking to get her loss to Germaine De Randamie turned into a no contest, and did so on gender discrimination grounds, her case being that she felt as though the reason why Herb Dean stepped in when he did was because he was worried that she was a woman and would not have done the same thing for a man. And as crazy as that sounds, the final vote on this was 3-2. So had one other person gone the other way on it, she actually would have won this appeal. So let's just go through the story, and then I'll go back to the actual fight footage and talk about whether or not it was a bad stoppage or a stoppage that shows any indication of gender bias. So this is from Mark Raimundi from ESPN. It says the fighter's attempt to get a TKO loss overturned on the grounds of gender discrimination was denied. The California State Athletic Commission voted 3-2 to uphold the TKO result from Germaine De Randamie over Aspen Ladd. Ladd's manager, Dave Hirschbein, argued during a hearing at the hotel that they did the hearing at that Dean stopped the fight prematurely due to a subconscious gender bias. Good luck proving that, although I guess to two of the people on the panel, he offered enough evidence. Because the fight was between two women, Ladd's team was asking the commission to overturn the result to a no contest. This is about our women being treated equally in the sport of mixed martial arts, the manager said. This is what we feel this is about. Okay, if you say so. Hirschbein said Ladd potentially lost millions of dollars with the loss because she could have earned a title shot had she won. Instead, De Randamie won and will fight Amanda Nunes for the title in December. He said the topics of referees stopping fights earlier in women's bouts is a frequent conversation among those inside MMA. Ladd said she'd been told by people that she is an inferior fighter in some ways because she is a woman. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. The quality of fighters in the women's divisions are far inferior to those in the men's division. That's not really debatable at this point. So if that's the point she's trying to make, I mean, they're right. So what are you mad about? Then he said, I've had people question my chin more so than a male teammate. I don't know that's an issue with you being a female, although, again, I think it's probably true that females have weaker chins than males. When you listen to people talk about Amanda Nunes, they don't talk about her as though she hits harder than most men. They talk about how she hits like a man, and this is a woman who knocks out most of her opponents in the UFC. So again, I don't even know if there's anything wrong about that, but there are men who are known to have weak chins. There are men that are known to have tough chins. So I don't know if that's necessarily like a gender thing more so than it's just a reference between her and a specific male teammate that she's talking about. She says it's common for people to believe that we function at a lesser degree than the males in the sport. Well, you do. So there's that. When asked by CSAC chairperson John Carvelli if he stopped the fight because Ladd is a woman, Dean said no. Dean said, I'm not a gender discriminator. Dean's a 17-year MMA referee who's regarded as one of the best in the profession. Dean said he stopped the fight between Ladd and De Randamie because he felt like Ladd had stopped intelligently defending herself. De Randamie landed a right hand, which dropped Ladd to her hands and knees with De Randamie behind her. De Randamie then wound up for another big punch as Dean came in to stop the fight. Quote from Dean, it says, at that point, I don't believe that she was aware of where her opponent was. Dean said, at that point, I don't see her doing any of the things that I would call intelligent defense. During the hearing, CSAC Commissioner Martha Shen Urquides showed slides from other UFC fights officiated by Dean between male fighters, with that referee being allowed to continue after heavy damage was done by one of the competitors. She then said that she believed Dean stopped the bout between Ladd and De Randamie after just one punch, or believed that by him doing that it violated anti-discrimination laws in California. I mean, you can pick and choose any fights that you want. There are fights between men where the stoppage is considered early and people complain about that. That happens all the time. There's stoppage between women where it seems as though it comes way too late. Most notably, the one with Mario Yamasaki in that match between Valentina Shevchenko and Priscilla Cachoeira. Again, that's the fight that got Yamasaki taken out of the sport pretty much. That was a fight between two women where Cachoeira pretty much took, I think she got struck like 250-3, and the ref let that keep going on. So if you want to pick and choose fights that build a narrative, you can definitely do that. The problem with this argument of making a gender discrimination thing is if you actually want to figure out if there is a gender bias in how referees handle stoppages, you would have to actually do some kind of study on it. No such study has been done. Even in terms of defining how that study would be run is interesting too, because you can't just say, well, how many unanswered strikes would you count? Because it's not just unanswered strikes that are accounted for when a ref decides to step in. Part of it's positional too, and if you're in a position where you can improve position or whether you're stuck in, it's a lot harder. So even doing the study would be difficult, but you would actually have to do that study first. If you're just going to go off of memory and say, hey, well, I remember this fight where a woman seemed to get stopped earlier. I remember this fight where a man seemed to get stopped late. that's not evidence, and that's definitely not enough evidence for you to be making judgment calls as a commissioner. But this particular commissioner felt like she had enough evidence to make a claim against Herb Dean and say that he was discriminating on sex. I think that's an absolutely ridiculous thing for her to do. She didn't actually go through the trouble of studying a bunch of fights. She just picked and chose a couple of examples of fighters who were given opportunities to fight on. Herb's had stoppages where people are like, wow, that's way too late. And he's had stoppages where people are like, wow, that's way too early. Any ref is going to have that. Just about any ref you have is going to have stoppages that people think are too early, and they're going to have stoppages that people think are too late. Even the refs that are known for letting fighters defend themselves maybe more so than they should be allowed to, they have early stoppages too. So this idea of a commissioner just picking and choosing specific fights and saying, hey, you let this fight go on, why don't you let the Ladd fight go on? That's ridiculous. If you're going to make an argument that this was the wrong stoppage and a bad stoppage and you're going to reverse it on that ground, I can see that. But if you're going to try to make a gender discrimination case without actually having like a full study here to prove anything, I think that's just a ridiculous way to go about it. So for 2 of the 5 commissioners to go ahead and vote in that way, I just think it's ridiculous. Let's just finish this off before I go to the actual footage. It said the CSAC vote went along gender lines. So Carvelli and Commissioners Luis Ayala and Vernon Williams voted to uphold Dean's ruling. Shen Urquidez and Vice Chairperson Mary Lehman voted against the motion to uphold the TKO law. So again, it's pretty weird that the 2 women on the board both felt as though this was gender discrimination. The 3 men felt it wasn't. I obviously side with the men on this, but not because I'm also a guy. I side with them because there just isn't evidence to support the idea that, for one, female fights are stopped sooner than men, but then for 2, that this specific one was an example where had it been 2 men fighting, they would have allowed it to go on. So that brings us to the actual knockout itself. I did a video on this after it happened called Are UFC Refs Sexist? A response to Ariel Helwani and Jim Norton. Both of them had made that claim after where they're like, well, maybe it's just because they're women that they allowed the fight to go on. I made the point in that video talking about Vasily Cachoeira and Valentina Shevchenko as well. I haven't been able to find another video of this knockout, so I'm just going to play it off of here. But what you're going to see happen is that when this punch lands, Ladd is no longer going to be facing her opponent, De Randamie. And if you think about what's going to happen in most cases, again, Herb Dean doesn't have the ability to tell the future of what's going to happen. He kind of has to see what's going on in front of him and sort of make an educated guess on whether or not a fighter's going to be able to continue to defend themselves. So when Ladd goes down, she's going to be facing the mat. She's not going to be facing De Randamie at all. Her hands are going to be on the mat. And with her hands on the mat, she's not going to be in a position to either block a punch or make any sort of effort to at least get into a position where she can at least face her opponent and defend herself intelligently. So, yes, he jumped in quickly, and yes, we did see after he stepped in that Ladd was still there consciously. But if you see a fighter get knocked down to the point where they're not even facing their opponent when they land on the ground, and then as the opponent comes to swarm in, the person who's knocked down doesn't make any sort of effort to intelligently defend themselves from there, more often than not, when that happens, that fighter's going to go out if the ref doesn't jump in. So, based off of that, it's hard to say it's a perfect stoppage because we do have hindsight and we do know that Ladd was still had her faculties after the stoppage came. But had we not seen that, if all you saw was this punch, the right hand right here, and then what happens after, you can make an argument that it was a perfectly fine stoppage and maybe even a great stoppage at that. So right here, again, you see both hands go down. She's not facing De Randamie in any way. Doesn't turn towards De Randamie, just sort of stares down at the ground right here with De Randamie behind her, has both hands on the ground, so she's not blocking her face. So she's not defending against strikes, but her positioning is also not defensive in any real way from a grappling standpoint either. So at this point, head looking straight down, hands down, Herb Dean steps in, or he's pretty much stepped in at this point. So you can see, again, hands down, not facing De Randamie, just got dropped. Not to me, this isn't like a terrible stoppage. Like, again, like I've said before, we know what happened, so in a way you can think to yourself, oh, it was a bad stoppage, just based off of hindsight, but she's not intelligently defending herself at all. And even with Herb Dean stepping in there was sort of like this assumption where she's not in a position to defend herself from another big strike. Herb Dean tries to step in, and that strike lands anyway. So even though Herb Dean tried to stop it, that big shot from Ladd that big shot from De Randamie that wasn't defended against still lands. And at this point, I mean, you could definitely expect her to just lay face up and be unconscious from here. So for me, I don't see too much of an issue with the stoppage itself. I can understand where Herb Dean was coming from, but to make this claim that it's like a gender discrimination thing, there's just no proof of it. And for 2 of the chair people to vote in that direction, I think it's just absolutely absurd. And I'm glad it didn't go through this time, but it could set a precedent for the future that we really don't want to see in this